Now that we've discussed entry models factoring in the zone wipe and liquidity built to the left, the last and final piece that we'll need to discuss is the early enticement entry. Now, as described in the Advanced Liquidity Concepts video, early enticement is when liquidity is created on the right side of a supply or demand zone when none is available to the left. The market tries to entice orders into the market early so that they can be used as liquidity for the true market movement. And as we can see, there are three different types of early enticement: the pre-interaction enticement, the post-interaction enticement, and the reactionary enticement. And we have two examples of a demand zone with no liquidity built to the left and a supply zone with no liquidity built to the left. So we're anticipating that liquidity is built to the right in the form of early enticement. So if we look at pre-interaction enticement and look at entries, we can see that price begins to trade higher above the higher time frame demand zone, and we're looking at a confirmation entry at the extreme. We see that price then trades lower, taking the structural liquidity that rests below this structural liquidity low of the early enticement. We tap into the higher time frame demand zone. We see price trade higher, taking out the last point of supply, which creates our tradable demand level. When price returns to that demand level, we look to trade long. A decisional entry, confirmation entry, would be when price creates that form of early enticement, trades lower, sweeps structural liquidity, and what we can see is that price trades into this higher time frame level of demand. Price trades away from it. We react off of the last point of supply, initial reaction, extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of the last point of supply. We then sweep below this structural liquidity low, move to the upside, seeing the last point of supply fail and creating our tradable zone. One thing to note as well, because the extreme has actually taken liquidity, the decisional doesn't necessarily need to take liquidity. And again, refer to the extreme versus decisional graphic and video for additional entry variations, as this video would take ages to film, as well as there would just be far too many different entry scenarios that could take place. This video just conveys a couple brief examples just to get your mind framed in the right direction. If we look at the double confirmation entry at the extreme level entry, we can see that price sweeps the pre-interaction early enticement, taps into the higher time frame demand level. We see a break of the last point of supply. Price then trades into our first level of respect that's formed. Price then breaks the last point of supply, forming our tradable zone. When price trades into that demand zone, we can look to trade long. A double confirmation decisional entry would be once the pre-interaction early enticement has been swept, we interact with the higher time frame level of demand. We can see that price interacts with the last point of supply, the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of the last point of supply, which creates our first level of respect. Price trades into that first level of respect, and we can see that price reacts off of the last point of supply, the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of the last point of supply, which creates our tradable demand level, which we can look to trade long when price taps into it. And again, because the extreme has taken liquidity, the decisional floor would not necessarily need to take liquidity. Now let's take a look at the supply example of the pre-interaction early enticement. No liquidity is on the left, so we anticipate that liquidity is likely to be built to the right in the form of pre-interaction early enticement. Now let's talk about the confirmation entry at the extreme. What we can see is once the pre-interaction early enticement is swept and price trades into the higher time frame level of supply, we wait for the last point of demand to fail. Once that last point of demand fails, price creates a level of supply that we can look to trade short once price interacts with this level. Now let's talk about the decisional level entry on a confirmation entry. Once the pre-interaction early enticement is swept and price trades into the higher time frame level of supply, we wait for price to react off of the last point of demand, initial reaction, extreme of reaction leg, the failure of that last point of demand, which creates our tradable decisional level that we can look to trade from. And in this example, the extreme has taken liquidity, so therefore we can trade the decisional, but there are different variations to this. And again, I ask you to refer to the extreme versus decisional graphic for additional entry variations. Now let's talk about double confirmation entries at the extreme level for pre-interaction early enticement. What we can see is the pre-interaction early enticement has been swept. We interact with the higher time frame level of supply. The last point of demand has failed, forming our first level of respect supply zone. Price then trades into the first level of respect and we see the last point of demand prior to the first level of respect fail, which creates our tradable supply level that we can look to trade short when price interacts with it. Finally, we have the decisional entry for a double confirmation entry. Once our pre-interaction early enticement has been swept and price trades into a higher time frame supply zone, we see that price reacts off of a last point of demand, initial reaction, extreme reaction leg, and the failure of that last point of demand. We can see that we have a level of structural liquidity as well. Price trades into the first level of respect and then begins to react off of that last point of demand and creates the initial reaction, the extreme reaction leg, and the failure of that last point of demand, which creates a tradable supply level that we can look to trade short when price interacts with that supply level. Now that we've talked about pre-interaction early enticement, we can talk about post-interaction early enticement, which is, as we know, very similar. The only difference is that price is interacting with the higher time frame level of demand and supply before being swept. So as we can see, we have a confirmation entry where we enter at the extreme. Price creates that level of early enticement. We start to break high. Price trades below the structural liquidity, and we trade the extreme demand level that is created. We have a decisional level entry for confirmation entry. You can see that we have early enticement. We have structural liquidity. Price then trades below this structural liquidity. And as we can see, we are trading a newly created decisional level. If we take this a step back, and we can see that price reacts off of this last point of demand. We get the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, and the failure. We sweep structural liquidity. So the decisional has swept liquidity, forming a new point of interest once this last point of supply fails. Once price trades into this level of demand, we can look to trade long. Now we have the double confirmation entry, trading at the extreme. So we have our early enticement that forms. We have structural liquidity. As we can see, when price creates this structural liquidity, we create a first level of respect at the extreme. Price then creates a reaction off of that first level of respect, causing the last point of supply to fail, which creates our tradable zone. And we would look to trade long when price enters that level of demand. And then the final situation would be the decisional entry at a double confirmation entry. So what we can see is we have early enticement. Price sweeps below the previous structural low or the early enticement. And as we can see, we get a demand reaction on the last point of demand. We get initial reaction, extreme reaction leg, failure, which sweeps structural liquidity. Price then trades higher, taking out the last point of supply, forming our first level of respect. Price trades into that first level of respect. We react off of the last point of supply, initial reaction, extreme reaction leg, failure. Price then trades below this structural and reactionary liquidity, breaks, causing the last point of supply to fail, and we get a demand level to look to trade long on. Now on the flip side, we have the supply post-interaction enticement. And again, we have the confirmation entry level at extreme, where we have the early enticement, we have structural liquidity. That early enticement is swept. Price trades to the extreme supply level and begins to trade lower. We would execute on this higher time frame level of supply once we see this last point of demand fail. Now we have the decisional entry for the confirmation entry. We have our early enticement. We can see price takes structural liquidity. We react off of the last point of demand, initial reaction, extreme reaction leg, failure, causing the last point of demand to fail, which creates our supply level that we can look to trade short from when price comes into it. Now let's move on to double confirmation entry, entering at the extreme. What we can see is we have our structural liquidity of our early enticement. Price sweeps that, and then we trade into the first level of respect. Once this first level of respect is interacted with, we see the last point of demand fail, which creates our new tradable supply level. We can look to trade short once price taps into this level of supply. And then finally, the decisional level entry of a double confirmation entry. We have our early enticement. Early enticement is swept. We trade into the first level of respect, which is the extreme here. We see price interact with the first level of respect, trade into the last point of demand, give a reaction, the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of the last point of demand. We see price trade higher, taking the liquidity above this structural liquidity, which allows us to trade from the decisional level, which creates our tradable zone to look to trade short when price interacts with it. Again, I urge you to refer to the extreme versus decisional graphics for additional entry variations. There are so many different variations that we can take note of when we're looking at whether to trade from the extreme or the decisional. So these are just brief examples of how to approach these situations. And the final example that we'll look into is the reactionary enticement. And this is where price reacts off of a higher time frame level of demand or supply, and then reacts off of a level of supply, gives a reaction, builds liquidity on both ends of the market before committing. So if we're looking at a confirmation entry at the extreme for reactionary enticement, what we can see is we react off of higher time frame demand. Price reacts off of the last point of supply. We get the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price trades lower, sweeping the liquidity built by this reaction, and then trades higher, seeing the last point of supply fail. This creates our demand zone that we can look to trade at the extreme. The decisional entry, we see that price reacts off of the higher time frame level of demand. We react off of the last point of supply, initial reaction, extreme of the reaction leg. We see the failure of the initial reaction, and then price trades lower, sweeping below the reactionary liquidity. Price then reacts off of this last point of supply. We get the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure, and the failure of this last point of supply, which creates our tradable level of demand. Then we can look at the decisional level entry of a confirmation entry. So what we can see is price reacts off of a higher time frame level of demand. We start to get that reaction. Price reacts off of the last point of supply, creating an initial reaction. The extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price then trades lower, sweeping below the reactionary liquidity that rests below these lows. We then see price trade higher, reacting off of the last point of supply here. We get the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, and the failure, seeing supply has truly failed in this sense. We've now established a new demand zone that we can take to look long. It's a decisional entry. The decisional has swept liquidity, therefore we can look to take the trade at this decisional level. Now we'll take a look at double confirmation entries using the extreme. We can see that we have a higher time frame demand zone. We get that reaction. We react off of the last point of supply, initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price trades lower, sweeping the reactionary liquidity that rests here. Price then causes the supply level to fail. We start to trade lower into the first level of respect. Once this last point of supply fails, we establish our first level of respect. Price interacts with that first level of respect. We see the last point of supply fail, which creates our tradable demand level. When price enters that demand level, we can look to trade long. And the final example, the decisional level entry of a double confirmation entry. Price interacts with the higher time frame demand level. Price then trades higher, trading into the last point of supply. We get an initial reaction, extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price then trades lower, sweeping below the reactionary liquidity below these lows. Price then trades higher, causing the last point of supply to fail, which forms our first level of respect. Price then trades lower into that first level of respect. We get the reaction. Price reacts off of that last point of supply. We get the initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, and the failure of supply, which forms our newly created supply zone after price sweeps below this structural liquidity low. Once we see this last point of supply fail, it creates a demand level that we can look to trade long from. And the final example, on the flip side, looking at the supply zone for reactionary enticement, we have the confirmation entry with the entry at the extreme. We have our higher time frame level of supply. Price reacts off of it. We trade into the last point of demand. We get our initial reaction. The extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price then trades higher, sweeping the reactionary liquidity that rests above this high. We trade lower, causing the last point of demand to truly fail, which creates our supply level that we can look to trade short once price returns into it. A confirmation at the decisional level entry would be price reacts off of the higher time frame level of supply. We start to trade lower. We react off of the last point of demand, initial reaction, extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price then trades higher, sweeping above the reactionary highs of this reaction. We then see price react off of the last point of demand, initial reaction, extreme of the reaction leg, and the failure. And then we see price trade into this newly created level of supply. And because this has swept liquidity, we're able to trade from the decisional level. And the final type, the double confirmation entry, trading at the extreme level. We can see that price reacts off of the extreme level of supply. We trade into the last point of demand. We get our initial reaction, the extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price then trades higher, sweeping above the highs of the reactionary liquidity. We see price then trade lower, causing demand to fail, which establishes our first level of respect. Once price interacts with that first level of respect, the last point of demand for that first level of respect fails, which creates our tradable level of supply that we can look to trade short when price interacts with it. And finally, we have the decisional level entry for our double confirmation entry. we have price reacting off of the higher time frame level of supply. We tap into the last point of demand. We get our initial reaction, our extreme of reaction leg, the failure of that initial reaction. Price then trades higher, taking the reactionary liquidity above this high. Price then trades lower, causing demand to fail, which establishes our first level of respect. Price then trades into that first level of respect. We trade into the last point of demand, initial reaction, extreme of the reaction leg, the failure of demand. Price then trades higher, sweeping above the reactionary and structural liquidity created in that. We then see the last point of demand fail. Price trades into this newly created supply level. Because it's swept liquidity, the decisional level would be the level that we could play. Again, please refer to the extreme versus decisional graphic for additional entry variations. There are so many different entry variations that we can play on all of these different liquidity model situations. Again, the main thing that we need to take note of in this entire lesson is not so much memorizing these entry models and the different variations of them, but instead asking ourselves the question, do I use a double confirmation entry or confirmation entry for my trades? Do I need additional confirmation because order flow is not certain? We don't know who's in control. The POI in question that I'm looking to trade from is questionable. There's no clear direction in the market, or I'm looking to trade a reversal. Then looking for the double confirmation entry is the way to go. Or am I trading pro trend, pro order flow? I'm confident in my POI. Then looking for a confirmation entry would be the way to go. And then the final consideration would be whether to trade at the extreme level or the decisional level. We would trade from the extreme level if no decisional level exists. We would trade from the extreme level if the extreme sweeps liquidity or does not sweep liquidity. We would trade from the decisional level if the extreme takes liquidity or the decisional level itself takes liquidity. At the end of the day, we can strip away almost all of these entry models and just come down to those 4 key points of which entry type to use and whether to trade from the extreme versus the decisional. These will be the pivoting things, and all of this is rooted within order flow. If you'll notice, every single situation that we discussed in here was heavily rooted on order flow, seeing in a buying situation that supply is failing, demand is starting to take control. Now, if we wanted that double confirmation entry, we would need to see supply fail, a first level of respect demand zone to form, price to trade into that first level of respect, react off of it, respect it, cause a failure of the next last point of supply, which would then create a demand zone that we can look to trade. And from that, we can gain that demand is truly in control. Again, the most important thing to take note of here, and I can't stress this enough, is the entry type, the double confirmation entry or the confirmation entry, where to trade from, the extreme versus the decisional, and everything that links all of that together and actually pulling the trigger on taking your trade is understanding order flow, who is in control, seeing that shift and that change in control that truly justifies your overall trade that you are taking.